Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second in the IC Squared series of roundtable discussions. Today, we're going to be talking about broadband access in smaller communities, and particularly questions relating to whether broadband ought to be thought of as a utility. I'm Art Markman, Executive Director of the IC Squared Institute, and I have with me today.
My name is Sharon Strover. I'm a professor in the School of Journalism and Media at UT Austin. I also co-direct the Technology and Information Policy Institute. I have written and done research around matters of broadband and digital literacy and digital divide for many years, and currently I'm examining its impact on rural entrepreneurship.
I'm Ken Flam. I'm a professor and an economist at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Sort of the economics of the broadband industry, technology adoption and diffusion are sort of my areas of interest. And I've been focusing in recent years on studying how broadband affects local economies, and in particular, the Texas economy.
I'm Sherry Greenberg. I'm a professor of practice at the LBJ School at UT Austin. I'm also a fellow of the Max Sherman Chair in State and Local Government. I have been doing research and working and teaching in these areas of technology policy for many years, and also a practitioner. And I have a particular focus on access for broadband and access as it applies to reliability, speed, and also affordability, and how that affects access to employment, to health, to transportation, and other aspects of our residents being able to participate in our society. I'm also director of future of work for Good Systems at UT.
Could you characterize a little bit of the current state of broadband access in Texas, particularly as we get outside of the urban centers?
Yeah, in Texas in general, talking about the current state of broadband is one of those it depends sorts of questions. It depends on whose data and statistics you're looking at, and it depends on what you're most concerned about. For example, there's a real difference between availability of some kind of signals, the capability of actually being able to connect to the internet. That is often framed as an issue of access to broadband. Beyond access, though, beyond the issue of whether or not there's a provider locally, there are a lot of other issues. One of them has to do with whether or not you can afford that connectivity. Another has to do with how good the signal is. For example, if you can get online on your cell phone at 10 megabits per second, well, you're connected. However, if you live in a household where with 3 people trying to use the internet simultaneously, and that is your connection, boy, that 10 megabit signal split 3 ways is really not going to make it. So issues of quality and speed, as well as reliability, come into play as well. And by reliability, I'm really referring to the question of whether or not your both access and your speed fluctuate.
I think that those are some really important points, because access can mean just, do you actually have the service, and then the quality, both the reliability and the speed, but can you afford the service, right? So there may be people who actually live in an area of a community, whether it's in the urban core or the outskirts or in a rural area, where there is decent connectivity, reliability, and speed, but they cannot afford it. Do you have your heat, or do you have your internet? And then there are other areas where the advertised speed or reliability may not be what's advertised. So we see all of these situations. But I certainly believe that internet should be a utility, that today you need your basic utilities. You have your water, your wastewater, your electric, and broadband, because certainly we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, what many of us have known for years and known here in Texas is that we have many of our residents who don't, for whatever reason, have the access. And whether it is K through 12 learning, college courses online, telemedicine, finding out in an emergency what to do, applying for jobs, it's a necessity to have that broadband, to have it reliable, to have it the speed, and to be able to afford it. That's an imperative.
So when we talk about broadband as a utility, so you've already mentioned a couple of things. So it's got to be reliable, presumably affordable. Could you guys go through a little bit of what you think are the defining characteristics that would make it a utility rather than just a service provided by a company?
There is an interesting history to that question with respect to broadband. Part of it has to do with the fact that one of the major providers, AT&T, was a regulated monopoly for decades. Basically, it was deregulated in technically 82. It took effect, the deregulation took effect in 1984. And with AT&T's move into the wholly private sector, there was an unleashing of a lot of new telecommunications services, as well as the notion that deregulation would really yield the best services and the cheapest costs. What Sherry was remarking on earlier with respect to the essentialness of broadband, I think moves us closer toward thinking about this particular service as a utility. Classically, utilities have been services we think of as infrastructure, as having high capital costs, as being so important that we want some regulatory authority over that particular service.
It is an interesting argument, absolutely, but I concur with needing this light touch. We, in the market economy, we do have regulation. And when we tend to see that is when we see something as a public good, right? As something that is essential as a public service for the public health, safety, and welfare, and we deem it a public good. And I believe that we are there now with broadband, which we commonly use that term to refer to high-speed internet access that is always on and is faster. And I think we are there.
One of the things we care about a lot here at IC Squared is economic development outside of these urban areas. And so, from our standpoint, and I'd love to have you guys comment on this a little bit, we really think that part of the problem is also that broadband tends to lag the market in many smaller areas, where until there's sufficient demand, you don't really get the companies coming out there. And yet economic development in the modern economy really requires that access already, which means that broadband actually needs to lead the market.
So I agree with that. And it's a phenomenon that we see in other areas. Let's take grocery stores, right? Real grocery stores. There are areas that are food deserts that need grocery stores, but of course the groceries, the big major grocery stores are going to say, well, we need the rooftops. Well, it's that chicken and egg. And I concur from an economic development standpoint, you may need to lead with broadband to have that infrastructure that we're talking about for economic development, whether it's in the rural areas or in some of these areas in the outskirts, right, of your major metropolitan areas.
And I think this is where the sort of legacy regulatory structure of broadband muddies the waters a lot. Back when telecom was deregulated in 96,
right?
I mean, think about 1996. Internet was just this thing on the fringe that a few university professors were using. Commercial services were just beginning to emerge. There was really no vision that internet-based services would become what they are, that they would become as dominant a part of our life as they are now. But I go back to that because that was the era in which this idea of broadband as a competitive, market-based service really flourished. Well, it's been about 25 years now in which all of the companies that were deregulated in 1996, some have consolidated, they bought each other up. They've had a lot of time to develop their services, but we're still seeing the deficiencies in rural areas. It kind of underscores that the market works really well where you have a lot of population density, like in urban areas. But because there has been a constant demand for more and better services in these heavily populous areas, that's where the providers have focused their attention.
And so whether it's in the outskirts or the rural areas, you don't see that. And I concur that it is time to pause because we've had enough time to look at that experiment and to see if the market would drive the kind of broadband that we need in the outskirts and in the rural areas. And we do also need to keep our focus on residents who technically have the access, the infrastructure is there, but they cannot afford it.
So another aspect of utilities, of course, is their reliability. We expect that the water is going to turn on when we turn on the water, and we expect that there's going to be electricity when we plug things into the wall. One of the things about broadband access not being a utility is that it is up to the consumer to really monitor their own their own quality of internet and to then negotiate as individuals with those companies to try to get the service that they think they need. So could you talk a little bit about how that might be different if internet were considered a utility?
Well, I would expect to find a lot more attention on certain aspects that entail educating consumers about not only their rights, but also how to use broadband most effectively. One component of some of the federal and state plans around the country, the states that have enacted any kinds of provisions for broadband, has been attention to what's called digital literacy. And that has a lot to do with educating people so that they know not only how to make best use of broadband for their own purposes, but also how to measure the kinds of speed and service quality that they're getting, and how to interact with an internet service provider, the ISPs. Unfortunately, Texas has done very little to encourage those sorts of arrangements. And indeed, we are one of 30 plus states that prohibits what municipal ownership of broadband, which kind of backs into this utility question.
That's right. Texas is a state that prohibits municipal ownership. You can see, for instance, Fort Collins, Colorado, an example in another state of real success with municipal. But it all is part of this discussion of the digital divide, digital inclusion or digital exclusion. And people can be excluded because of the lack of access that we've talked about, the lack of affordability, the lack of education. All of these are ways in which people can be excluded. Now, of course, we've seen that the CARES Act had about, I think it was $7 billion in it for broadband stimulus and, for rebates for folks, but that is not continued funding. The state of Mississippi used the funding that it got to really expand broadband in that state. So there are some efforts that we're seeing at the federal level, at the state level. Governor Abbott here has made broadband one of his original emergency items, but the details still remain, right, as to how will this occur. If it were a utility, would it be guaranteed, such as your other utilities? Would there be some sort of subsidy or rebate on a lasting basis at some type of income level? I think that these are policy questions that we have to ask.
Texas is a fascinating state from a regulatory perspective.
Right.
We certainly, with the massive snowstorm that we saw just in February, we saw some of the limitations of our being off the national grid,
Right.
for the most part. And so in that environment, what does the policy landscape look like moving forward in thinking about the prospects for what broadband might look like over the next 10 years?
Well, I think it's interesting. Texas did convene a governor's group that has been brainstorming and soliciting a lot of research and input from around the country around the matter of how to enhance broadband. And a few of the people who have contributed to some of their dealings have advocated for at least authorizing municipal utility ownership of broadband facilities. Right now, of course, it has been prohibited. In fact, we were the first state to prohibit municipal involvement in or ownership of broadband facilities, and then that was subsequently adopted by several other states. But now, if you look around the country, you see evidence of several states that have been quite creative, actually, in growing both the constituencies to manage broadband, in authorizing municipal broadband, and in crafting new public-private partnerships as well as alternative ways to offer ISP services to a wide variety of geographies.
We will see more in this legislative session. The governor did convene, and they did lots of research with the Connected Nation and a large report. And then, as I said, made it emergency item. There have been bills filed. There's HB 425 by King that would relate to the use of the Universal Service Fund for the provision of broadband services in underserved rural areas. That's an example. Another one is Senate Bill 154 by Perry, relating to the creation of the broadband office within the Public Utility Commission of Texas and the establishment of a broadband service investment grant. So those are pieces of legislation that have been filed, and with the work that the governor's group did and the emergency item, it's getting a lot of attention. But we don't know yet what the actual results will be from this legislative session, what will actually make it to the governor's desk and become public policy.
Overall, in the entire US, 26% of households reported that internet for educational use was not always available in their home. In Texas, by way of contrast, that was 31%. So we kind of lagged the nation back in February. However, there's also more detailed data available for the two largest sort of urban areas in Texas, the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area and the Houston metro area.
Mm-hmm.
And in Dallas-Fort Worth was a little better than the Texas average at 29% of households not having internet always available for educational purposes. Houston was actually worse at 32%. But if you fast forward to February of 21, like now, it turns out there was enormous progress made in Texas. The US overall went from 26 to 23, but Texas, the sort of unconnected, reliably share of households dropped precipitously from 31 to 26. So we're still behind the national average, which is 23, but we made a pretty big jump compared to where we were back a year ago.
And Ken, I think that really ties into a discussion that we were having just a little while ago, and that is that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought so much of this to the forefront, and the need to, not just in rural areas, but in urban areas, have that reliability, connectivity, and affordability, right? And the attention that we've seen, whether it's school buses being used as hotspots, in areas, urban areas such as Harris County, having to go to the fast food for internet. And there has been, I think, this attention too, with the need for education and telemedicine, some increased deployment of both of hotspots, of subsidies, and of even the devices, right? So
if I could jump in, the Texas Education Agency kind of rose to the moment and actually got some additional funding and devoted a lot of resources to urban school districts in particular with hotspots.
Right, that's what I'm talking about.
Rolled out a lot of hotspots to families that lacked home-based broadband, which leads to one issue that is weaving through a lot of national debates as there is more recovery funding allocated to broadband purposes. And that is the extent to which a lot of federal dollars and sometimes state dollars go to plans that ultimately really benefit and buoy the conventional companies, the conventional providers that have kind of put us in this situation to begin with by not making foundational investment in wireline affordable broadband.
The numbers actually say that, so they asked individual households whether they had received this, whether government or educational institutions had subsidized or had paid for use of internet connections versus computers. And it looks like a whole lot more households got computers than got internet connections, which kind of goes in the other direction. In fact, actually a fairly small fraction of the households received help with their internet, with subsidization of their internet connections from government. It was mainly devices, which actually raises a lot of interesting questions.
That's why I was mentioning devices, because yes, I have seen that a lot of this has been, in fact, in the way of devices, whether for education or for telehealth and telemedicine. And what you see in many of these households of under-resourced households is there may only be a phone. Well, that makes it very difficult to participate in education online or do your homework or have telemedicine, or there may be one device that's being shared by 6 people. And so this provision of the devices has been very important.
We have just a couple of minutes left, and so to try and bring some closure to the discussion today, I just want to ask one question, which is, if you're speaking right now to an economic development person or a community leader or even a community member in a smaller community outside of those urban centers, what should they be doing right now in order to try to improve their likely state of internet access over the next couple of years?
Again, looking at the numbers I just looked at, if you look at Texas overall, incomes greater than $200,000 a year for family income, something like 3% of households did not have always have internet access for educational uses in their houses. If you go down to the lowest income level reported in this survey, less than $25,000, 38% of households did not have consistent access to internet for educational purposes. So the divide we're talking about is not so much, I think, urban as rural, as high income versus low income. There's a really strong relationship between family income and access to the internet. And it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I mean, historically, income has always been one of the most powerful predictors, along with age. Incidentally, older people tend not to be connected for a variety of reasons. But I would tell rural economic developers is to really do a careful survey of not only current providers in their region, but nearby providers, what I might call would-be providers. And I would say 2 things. Think of what might be possible now, between now and 2024, because during that 3-year period of time, there is some federal money that is available to alter the distribution of high quality internet service provision. That may mean investment in services that can be launched quickly, and ameliorate current problems. However, for me, I'm really very interested in the long term as well. And that means more fundamental investment in fixed line infrastructures, fiber, other forms of cable, for example, that can deliver more reliable and high speed services.
I certainly concur with both the points of Ken and Sharon that access is about having the infrastructure, the reliability, the speed, and as we've talked about, access is, can you afford it? Do you have to make a decision living in an urban area, not just a rural, but also an urban area, between having the heat on and paying for your internet, having your child have education or food? These are real issues. Beyond that, I do think that we have an opportunity right now to look at what some other cities and states have done, whether it's Fort Collins, Colorado as a municipality, or I brought up Mississippi. Mississippi really has accelerated in an astonishing way broadband access, the broadband miracle they're calling it, with the stimulus dollars that they got. And so that is another case study that's interesting to look at right now, particularly when you talk, Art, about rural areas, right, without access and, you know, without having that infrastructure. But I come back to broadband as a public good, as a utility, and that right now we have a lot of attention on this, whether it's because of stimulus funds, other legislation that's being proposed at the federal level, at the state level, with the work that the governor's task force done, and with it being an emergency item and bills that have been filed in the legislature. This is the time, right, to let your policymakers know, whether they're in the state legislature or in Congress, how important this issue is for our entire state, for the health, the well-being, the economic development of our state, and to go ahead and do what's necessary for this to truly be accessible with the speed, with the reliability, and with the affordability that this big, vast state needs.
Well, Sherry Greenberg, Sharon Strover, Ken Flam, thanks so much for spending some time with us today to talk about this. It's as you know, an incredibly important issue for many of the communities that we here at IC Squared serve, and we appreciate your expertise in sharing it with everyone. So